This episode contains discussion of real-world violence, including murder and assault. It is explored with care, but some listeners may find this difficult. Please take care whilst listening. Recognition changes people, not only because of what becomes understood, but because of what understanding begins doing emotionally once uncertainty starts hardening into belief. Because there comes a point in cases like this where fear no longer exists only as possibility. It begins settling into expectation. And over time, expectation starts reshaping behaviour in powerful ways. Once people begin emotionally accepting that danger may be repeating itself, ordinary life starts becoming interpreted differently. Familiar environments feel less emotionally neutral. Coincidences feel heavier. Uncertainty becomes harder to dismiss. And gradually, the emotional atmosphere surrounding everyday life begins changing in ways that are both visible and invisible at the same time. Fear becomes easier to anticipate, easier to carry emotionally before anything has even happened. And anticipation itself can become just as influential as direct experience. Because human beings do not only respond to danger after it arrives. We respond to the possibility of danger long before certainty fully forms. And once enough people begin responding that way simultaneously, fear stops existing only as an individual emotional experience. It begins becoming collective. Welcome. It's a pleasure to have your company. I'm Jenny. I love history and I am fascinated by the moments where human psychology collides with it in the worst possible ways. This is Hidden Chronicles, Season 3, The Yorkshire Ripper, Episode 5, Recognition. By this stage in the case, emotional uncertainty was beginning to evolve into something heavier. Not full understanding, not complete certainty. But something significant had started happening within both public awareness and investigative thinking. People were no longer simply reacting to isolated incidents. Increasingly, they were beginning to emotionally interpret those incidents as connected. And that shift matters enormously. Because once human beings begin recognizing the possibility of pattern, perception itself changes. Events that might previously have felt unrelated begin carrying different emotional weight. Information becomes interpreted differently. Attention narrows. People become more alert to potential threats, more sensitive to uncertainty, and more aware of vulnerability within ordinary life. And importantly, that awareness does not always produce clarity, as we have said before. Sometimes it can produce hypervigilance instead. Hypervigilance is a state of heightened emotional and physical alertness, a constant monitoring of surroundings, behaviours, environments, and possibilities in anticipation of danger. And whilst hypervigilance can develop after direct trauma, it can also emerge socially through prolonged exposure to fear, uncertainty, and repeated emotional tension within communities themselves. At this stage, that tension was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Not because every detail was fully understood, but because emotionally the possibility of repetition had started feeling more real than coincidence. One of the most powerful aspects of collective fear is that it begins altering emotional behaviour, even among people who have not experienced direct harm themselves. Because human beings learn socially. We observe each other constantly. We absorb emotional information through conversations, behaviour, media, and shared perception. And once enough people begin behaving cautiously, that caution itself becomes contagious. Routes change, conversations change. The emotional tone surrounding ordinary routines begins changing, and gradually, fear embeds itself into the background of everyday life. Women who had once moved through familiar environments without needing to consciously assess risk now found themselves thinking differently. Not necessarily because every environment had objectively changed, but because perception of safety had changed. And perception matters. Because human beings respond emotionally not only to reality itself, but to what they believe reality may have become. That distinction is important. Because fear rarely requires complete certainty before it begins reshaping behaviour. Often, possibility alone is enough. In 1979, Josephine Whitaker was killed. She was 19 years old. And again, it is important to resist allowing chronology to flatten individuality. Because behind every name connected to this case, there existed a person whose life contained relationships, routines, ordinary moments, emotional experiences, and futures that extended far beyond the violence that later brought them into public memory. That matters, not only ethically, but emotionally as well. Because once victims become reduced entirely to sequence and investigation, emotional distance begins replacing emotional recognition. And emotional distance changes the way that violence is understood. By this stage in the case, however, emotional distance was becoming harder for the wider public to maintain. Because repeated incidents gradually change the emotional relationship communities have with fear itself. Not suddenly, but cumulatively. Through repetition, through anticipation, through the growing sense that ordinary life may no longer be emotionally predictable in the ways that people once trusted it to be. And as human beings, predictability matters. We rely heavily upon stable expectations in order to feel emotionally secure within daily life. We expect familiar routes to remain familiar. We expect familiar routines to remain familiar. We expect our ordinary environment to remain emotionally manageable. And when repeated uncertainty begins weakening those assumptions, vigilance often increases in order to compensate. At the same time, investigative pressure continued intensifying. And pressure alters cognition in complicated ways. Attention narrows, interpretation changes. Decision-making becomes increasingly influenced not only by evidence itself, but by urgency, expectation, emotional fatigue, and the growing need for resolution. And importantly, investigations unfolding under prolonged uncertainty often exist inside competing demands. The need to act quickly, the need to avoid mistakes, the need to recognise patterns accurately, the need to avoid becoming trapped by assumptions. And balancing those demands becomes progressively more difficult as public fear escalates. Because prolonged uncertainty becomes emotionally draining not only for communities, but institutionally as well. Human beings are not naturally comfortable remaining inside unresolved tension indefinitely. We seek explanation. We seek certainty. We seek emotional closure capable of restoring predictability to environments that no longer feel entirely secure. And once pressure for certainty becomes intense enough, interpretation itself can begin changing under the emotional weight of expectation. In 1980, Shirley Banks was killed. She was 29 years old. And once again, it is important to pause before allowing the structure of the case to overshadow the individuality of the person within it. Because behind public recognition, investigation, media attention, and analysis existed real lives interrupted permanently by violence. Lives with histories, relationships, memories, ordinary moments that mattered to the people who lived them. And recognising that matters because repetition can sometimes create emotional numbing within public consciousness. The more events repeat, the easier it can become for people to process them structurally, rather than personally, as pattern, as investigation, as headline, instead of as individual human loss. And that distancing effect can become one of the most unsettling consequences of prolonged exposure to violence within public life. Because over time, fear does not only reshape behaviour, it can begin reshaping empathy itself. Looking back, it can be tempting to imagine recognition as clarity. as the point where confusion ended and understanding finally arrived. But recognition often creates its own forms of tension. Because recognizing the possibility of danger does not immediately explain it. It simply changes the emotional reality people begin living inside. And by this stage in the case, that emotional reality was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Not only within investigations, but within everyday life itself. Before we close, it is important to take a moment to step away from fear, investigation, and analysis, and return to the people at the centre of it. Josephine Whitaker, Shirley Banks. Both were individuals whose lives extended far beyond the circumstances discussed here. Lives shaped by relationships, routines, experiences, memories, and futures that existed independently of this case. And recognizing that matters. Because without that recognition, it becomes too easy to focus only on a pattern, escalation, or public fear, whilst losing sight of the people most deeply affected by them. In the next episode, we move further into the growing psychological weight surrounding the investigation, examining how prolonged fear, media attention, and repeated uncertainty continued shaping both public perception and investigative response. Thank you for listening. I'm really glad you joined me. If you're enjoying Hidden Chronicles, be sure to follow along so that you don't miss what comes next. As always, take care and be gentle with what history leaves behind.